Okay, welcome back to our final week of our semester, week 12, American Literature, a genre study of mystery fiction. So let's do a review of how much material we have covered this past semester. So let's start with our quote from Neil Gaiman, who says that fiction gives us empathy. It puts us inside the minds of other people, gives us the gifts of seeing the world through their eyes. Fiction is a lie that tells us true things over and over. So this is a pretty good reason to study fiction. So we differentiated between fiction mysteries and nonfiction mysteries. And an important difference between fiction and nonfiction mysteries is that fiction mysteries almost always end with the mystery being solved, while nonfiction mysteries typically exist to address mysteries that remain unsolved. So we started out and we took a look at a TV series from the 1980s called Unsolved Mysteries. And this was a big smash hit for television back in the day. And it covered different mysteries and crimes that were unsolved. But by way of the viewing audience of the TV series, many of those unsolved crimes and mysteries, through the information given by the viewers, were eventually solved. Okay, so from here, we talked about the mystery novel. And most critics and scholars credit Edgar Allan Poe with inventing the modern mystery and literature's first fictional detective. Now, just recently I read that the Metropolitan Police in London, about the same time that Poe is writing his first mystery detective story with Augustin Dupin, the police force had actually put together a elite squad of police officers that were going out to try to resolve crimes, mostly pretty, murders and that sort of thing, by way of sort of clues, putting together a step-by-step analysis. So this was kind of in the wind when Poe started writing his story, but there were no consulting detectives at that time. So it was kind of at the very root and beginning of sort of detective type police officers during the day. I'm not sure if they called them detectives per se, but nevertheless, it was at the same time as the police were starting to solve crimes through step-by-step analysis of clues and evidence. So we talked about some of the sub-genres of mystery and crime fiction, detective novels such as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, cozy mysteries by Agatha Christie, police procedural stories, and the caper story. And we basically covered all four of these throughout the semester. So just as a defining point for caper stories, unlike most mysteries, caper stories often include elements of humor, and it's from the point of view of the criminal. We talked about the structure of a mystery novel, the crime itself, usually introduced very early into the story, followed by some type of investigation, usually some kind of twist, maybe a red herring for the reader to put you on the wrong trail, some kind of breakthrough, and finally a conclusion. So the breakdown of the mystery story in detective fiction usually starts with an exciting hook. Now, most teachers of writing would say that the hook begins within the first paragraph. But my personal opinion is the hook really starts with the title. And if we look at the title of our stories, let's say Edgar Allan Poe's The Murder of the Rue Morgue. Okay, and if he had just titled it The Murder in Paris, well, not so exciting. But The Murders of the Rue Morgue, well, now, yeah, that has a little mysteriousness to it, kind of catches your eye. Doyle's A Study in Scarlet, Scarlet being the color red of blood. Okay, so really I think the hook for fiction, detective fiction, and mysteries really starts with the title itself. Okay, so the mystery novel draws in the reader from the first paragraph, or better yet, the first sentence. And it sets a mysterious mood, a dark setting, such as maybe an abandoned building or an isolated cabin in the woods, reveals information slowly, creates the element of suspense by controlling how much information is revealed. The story leaves clues behind and makes the reader feel like they're a part of the story. And the story usually provides a few red herrings, again, leading either the detective or you, the reader, in the wrong direction. It could be details about the people or the place, maybe objects that may not be true, that are found, that are part of the crime, and misguide them with contradicting evidence or statements by witnesses. So there are many ways that a red herring could appear. The conclusion of the mystery story does tie up all the loose ends. So we talked a little bit more in depth about the investigative techniques, motive, means, and opportunity. So motive to commit the crime. What was the reason? Maybe financial gain. possibly revenge. And it's basically a way to explain why a person committed the crime. Motives for murder. It's always been said it's either love, money, or secrets. Kind of trying to boil it down into the top three. But actually there are many more motives in the murder detective fiction stories. Of course, it could be money, secrets and lies, greed, revenge, hate and obsession, love and jealousy, a crime of passion, mental illness, protecting a loved one, empathy and sympathy, covering up for another crime, or even mistaken identity. The means to commit the crime includes the tools or the physical capabilities. If a person is left-handed and the murder has taken place by somebody using their right hand, then that obviously that person could not have committed the crime. The opportunity to commit the crime was the person or the suspect at the crime scene at the time of the offense. They will also establish the relationships between the victim and any potential offenders. So this is a little bit on the police procedural bit of it. And how do the police determine or establish means, motive, and opportunity? And one way is through interviewing the witnesses, family, friends, taking witness statements, search for inconsistent statements or outright lies, the physical evidence, maybe looking at bank records, text messages, vehicle GPS, airline tickets, movie stubs, see if any of the witnesses can recall seeing the suspect at the place and at the time the suspect was purported to be. If he has an alibi location, then who saw him there? What proof does he have that he was there at the time that the crime took place? It could be things as simple as gas receipts, toll booth scans, traffic camera photos, surveillance video cameras from the crime scene and places nearby where a suspect claims to have been at the time of the murder. Also documents, legal documents such as wills, custody agreements, any debts, again, getting back to bank statements, the alibi, and alibi in evidence and is a Latin word which means elsewhere. Then from there, we took a look at mystery novels and what knowledge can be gained from detective fiction that can be applied to real-life problems by Joan Mixon. And one of them is looking for misdirection. The easiest way to fool someone is to make it appear that you are planning to do one thing when in reality the directions of your true plans lie elsewhere. John Mixon says what people should realize is what appears to the plans of your opposition could simply be a feint that misdirects your attention. Avoiding confirmation bias. And this is when you are presented with something. Make certain that you understand it for what it is rather than what you want or need it to be. Tough one. It's often far too easy to see something or allow your own confirmation bias to allow you to perceive it as something else. And you have to ask the question of what's in it for them. You need to really trust your instincts. And if it seems like a bad idea, it probably is. Rationing your trust. You should be careful about whom it is that you trust. And that comes over time. Okay, so from there, we talked a little bit about the traits of a detective. And from Augustin Dupin to Sherlock Holmes to Hercule Poirot, we see quite a difference in character, physical appearance, ages, locations, setting, and probably most important, the time, the actual historical time of when these detectives' stories were written. Okay, so a detective's appearance can have a major effect on his or her effectiveness on the job. So, like we said, in, let's say, Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot, he is very well dressed, kind of high-end, high-polished. He worries more about getting his shoes dirty than anything else. Augustin Dupin, we don't really have a lot of description about him, just kind of nothing out of the ordinary, although he was from the upper class, but the family was suffering some kind of financial difficulties. He had enough money so he didn't have to work, but he had to be careful about how he spent his money. And of course, Sherlock Holmes, he dressed in a very, I would say, classic style of the day, but not certainly as high end as Hercule Poirot. We look at Miss Marple, Agatha Christie's Miss Marple. We talked about her a little bit. Older grandmother type, kind of listens in on other people's conversations, but no one would really suspect her as being a detective. She just doesn't fit the role, however she is. Okay, so there we talked a little bit about a guide to creating the perfect detective character by C.T. Mitchell. Great detectives often have some outstanding ability, great skills of deduction, perhaps can read minds or understand human psychology. Think of Hercule Poirot and his, quote, little gray cells. He needs expertise in another field. He might have a medical background or be into science, such as Sherlock Holmes and all of his experiments. Chief Inspector Morse had a extreme, well-read knowledge of his area, Oxford and around Oxford University, and history that helped him numerous times to solve crimes. They are usually some kind of a misunderstood outsider. Sherlock Holmes is the perfect example of that. They can be loners. All three, Dustin Dupin, Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot. We never hear about any marriages or long-term female relationships. These guys are bachelors through and through. They are very self-aware and very confident in themselves, bordering on kind of being superior to others. Usually they have some kind of a bumpy career. Sherlock Holmes, again, not always working. When he wasn't working, fell into depression and drug use. Crimes maybe happen every day, but they weren't set out or called upon to solve them. All of them have a powerful sense of justice. Their work partner is the complete opposite of them. Sherlock Holmes and Watson, Dustin Dupin and his unnamed fellow. Hercule Poirot did, even in the Murder of the Orient Express, the doctor and the owner of the train company kind of became his partners, that he would bounce the information that he collected off of. Usually not a great help to Hercule Poirot. However, that's just the way it was. These detectives are kind of an enigma, hard to figure out, bordering on the strange and mysterious. They just don't seem to fit in regular society. And they don't blend in with their work colleagues, usually the police detectives. There's always some kind of banter between Sherlock Holmes and Lestrade, or they're kind of at odds with the police. They don't really look upon the police in a very positive way. They're kind of overconfident, again, in their own abilities, and kind of see the police as kind of getting in the way or making mistakes or kind of bumbling along. We talked a little bit about the background of each of the authors, starting off with Edgar Allan Poe, who was born in Boston. He attended the University of Virginia. He failed as an officer cadet at West Point, which forced him to move among several cities, including Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City. He marries his 13-year-old cousin, Virginia Clem, but she dies about 10 years later. That seems kind of odd in today's standards, but it wasn't really unusual back in the early 1800s. He planned for years to produce his own journal called The Pen or The Stylist. But before he could actually make that happen, He dies in Baltimore, Maryland, at the age of 40. Now, the cause of his death is unknown, but has been variously attributed to either disease, alcoholism, substance abuse, or suicide, or, like himself, in some kind of mystery. Okay, and then finally we talked about a song called Mac the Knife, which is an old German song from John Gay's The Beggar's Opera about a highwayman, which is a thief, a robber, based on his character. So from there, we get into the mystery of Marie Roget, and it was, of course, a sequel to The Murders in the Rue Morgue. We've been introduced to C. Augustin Dupin, and The Murders in the Rue Morgue was the first murder mystery based on details of a real crime which took place in New York. The Marie Rogers murder. A lot of the details are exactly alike, including the jobs and rivers and bodies and that sort of thing. So Poe actually took from the newspapers a real-life murder mystery in New York and puts it into Paris. So Dupin rejects the popular theory blaming the murder on a gang of ruffians seen in the area. That was the first kind of clue. I think the police were kind of leaning in that direction by way of some of the witnesses. Dupin says, no, it didn't happen that way. He determines that it was a single murderer, probably a sailor. Again, based on the actual murder of Mary Cecilia Rogers, who worked in a tobacco shop known as the Beautiful Cigar Girl, and her body was found floating in the Hudson River in New York. The death of this well-known woman received national attention for weeks. Months later, while the inquest was still ongoing, her fiance was found dead in an act of suicide, and by his side a remorseful note and an empty bottle of poison were found. Writing about Rogers as a sequel to the Murders in the Rue Morgue, Poe tried to solve the aforementioned enigma by creating a murder mystery. So, in short, Poe reads about the story of Marie Cecilia Rogers, comes up with his own theory, and writes the story of Marie Roget. None of it has ever been solved. so I guess we'll never know. He kind of fictionalized actual events, especially murder, was common in this period of American literature. See Augustin Dupin, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, considered the first detective fiction story. Dupin is not a professional detective. Poe created the Dupin character before the word detective had been coined. The character laid the groundwork for fictional detectives to come, including Sherlock Holmes. And when we get into the compare-contrast, we can see a lot of the character traits of Sherlock Holmes come straight out of Poe's Dupin. Dupin was once from a wealthy family. He now lives in Paris with a close friend, the anonymous narrator of the stories. Dupin shares some features with the later gentleman detective, a character type that became common in the golden age of detective fiction. The character depicted a reclusive man who prefers his own company and also prefers to work at night in the candlelight. He smokes a mushroom pipe, same as Sherlock Holmes. And Dupin is shown as a character that likes to stay away from traditional ways of law enforcement, preferring to develop his own techniques and innovative ways to solve mysteries. He believes the French police way of investigating are stale and unoriginal. Dupin views a crime scene as a scientist or mathematician by removing his emotions and looking at it objectively. He tries to gather all the tiny details and calculate the moves in the murder as one would in a chess game. Dupin is a well-constructed and very enjoyable character. Well, I don't know. Kind of dull and boring, actually, but anyway. He was a reflection of the times and may have been a nudge to the police that they need to work better. Dupin is portrayed as a dehumanizing thinking machine. Dupin's method is to identify with the criminal and put himself in his mind. Dupin's method also emphasizes the importance of reading and writing. Many of his clues come from newspapers or written reports from the police. The inspiration for Dupin was a French minister of police, a real live person. Sherlock Holmes was one of several fictional detectives influenced by Dupin. You can see a little of Dupin in Hercule Poirot as well. Many tropes that would later become commonplace in detective fiction first appear in Poe's stories. The eccentric but brilliant detective, the bumbling constabulary, the first-person narration by a close personal friend. We learn that Dupin spends what little money he has on books. We did talk a little bit about the Purloined Letter, a summary of that story. Of course, C. Augustin Dupin only appears in 3 stories, the last one being the Purloined Letter. And he actually kind of gets out a little bit more from his hideaway on the outskirts of Paris to actually involve himself with the characters and with the suspect to solve the mystery. We then talked about Bob Dylan's song, Hurricane Carter, based again on a true story of Reuben Carter, who was an American-Canadian middleweight boxer who was wrongfully convicted of murder and later released following a petition of habeas corpus after serving almost 20 years in prison. Did this Bob Dylan's song Hurricane Carter have something to do with it? Maybe, possibly so. From here, we talked about Sir Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle, kind of an introduction to him. Born in Scotland, 1859. So we're talking about almost 50 years difference between Poe's writing and Doyle's writing, which we talked about the differences in technology, cities, the growth of London at the time. We've got into a lot of detail about that. But nevertheless, we talked about Conan Doyle's family at an early age became scattered because of his father's alcoholism. And he was supported by wealthy uncles that sent him to England, first to a Jesuit preparatory school, and then he goes on to college. He spends some time at a Jesuit school in Austria to better his German language. He, as a student of medicine, he ends up as a doctor on a whale ship off the coast of Greenland. And he does graduate with a Bachelor of Medicine and a Master of Surgery degrees from the University of Edinburgh. And he becomes the ship's surgeon on a voyage to the West African coast. He later volunteers and is found in South Africa during a war, the Boer War in South Africa. So Doyle gets around. He's seen the world. He's quite well educated. He decides to go in partnership with a former classmate to set up a medical practice in England, but they didn't get along very well. And so Doyle leaves to set up an independent practice. That doesn't go very well. He finds himself with a lot of free time, and this is when he starts writing his stories. We talked a lot about the kind of setting the scenery of Sherlock Holmes' London in the time of his stories. And this was a very, of course, London is a growing city, immigrant populations. There are sections of the city that are very wealthy, and a lot of sections of the city with a lot of poverty. Pollution, a very smoky atmosphere prevailed at the times because of industry and concentration of domestic fires, meaning, people wanted to heat their homes back then. They burnt coal or wood in a fireplace, and all that smoke was in the air and just kind of sat there. There were the beginnings of electric lights, but the two-wheeled hansom cab was the most common type of local transportation in London during the Victorian era. An extreme population density in areas like the East End made for very unsanitary conditions, which resulted in epidemics of disease. The most serious in those poverty-stricken areas was tuberculosis. Doyle struggles to find a publisher for his work. His first work, featuring Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, A Study in Scarlet, was written in about 3 weeks. He was 27 years old, and after some time it was finally accepted for publication. Holmes was partially modeled on Doyle's former university teacher, Joseph Bell. Doyle's attitude towards his most famous creation was ambivalent. He says in 1891, he writes a letter to his mother and says, I'm thinking of slaying Holmes and winding him up for good and all. He takes my mind from better things. I think he really wanted to write history or history fiction more than detective fiction. But his mother writes back and says, quote, you won't, you can't, you mustn't. In another attempt to deflect a publisher's demands for more Sherlock Holmes stories, he raises his price to a level intended to discourage them. But he finds out that they're willing to pay him even the large sums he's demanding. And as a result, he becomes one of the best paid authors of his time. He wants to dedicate more of his time to his historical novels. Doyle has Holmes and his nemesis, Professor Moriarty, plunged to their deaths together at the Rickenback Falls in a story called The Final Problem. The public outcry, however, led him to feature Holmes a few years later, in 1901, in a novel, one of his most famous, called The Hound of the Baskervilles. So Doyle himself was a football player, and this football would be rugby. He played cricket. He was a bodybuilder, a boxer, a golfer, a billiard player. And again, as we've said over and over, authors tend to write about what they know best. And we see a lot of this in either Watson or Sherlock Holmes in terms of their physical activities that they engaged in. Doyle was kind of odd. He had kind of a long-standing interest in mystic subjects. He became part of the spiritualist movement later in his life, which was people who, through seances, could call up the recently departed and have conversations with them. And he kind of waxed and waned between believing, not believing. But it's interesting to note that Sherlock Holmes absolutely did not believe in anything of the mystical subjects. So maybe that was his outlet for his more science-based thinking. So we talked a little bit about the character of Sherlock Holmes and why he's such a great character. And part of it was the art of the Holmesian deduction. Perhaps the most apparent strength in Sherlock Holmes' character is his ability to draw large conclusions from the smallest of observations. And we saw this several times, even with Watson trying to imitate it and failing badly. He's kind of a bohemian, I guess, for his day. He had a keen understanding of human emotion and behavior, but he had an inability to empathize. This is a very serious guy. Very little display of human emotion on his part. He has an ability to block out useless information. He is the world's only consulting detective, a profession he created for himself. He is known for his proficiency with observation, deduction, forensic science, logical reasoning that borders on the fantastic, which he employs when investigating cases for a wide variety of clients, including Scotland Yard. A statement of Holmes' age places his birth in 1854. His parents aren't mentioned at all, although he mentions that his ancestors were country squires, and he claims that his grandmother was sister to the French artist Vernet. Holmes has an older brother, Mycroft, 7 years his senior, and is a government official. We're introduced to him in the movies. He describes his brother as the more intelligent of the two, but notes that Mycroft lacks any interest in physical investigation, preferring to spend his time at the Diogenes Club. Some Sherlockians conjecture that he and Mycroft were orphaned young. And Mycroft is apparently the only person allowed to disparage Sherlock's talents without arousing his temper. So in the study in Scarlet, we talk about how Watson has just returned from Afghanistan as a wounded military officer, and he's looking for a place to rent. And through a character named Stanford, a classmate of Dr. Watson, he is introduced to Sherlock Holmes. And Watson is trying to guess Sherlock Holmes' profession. And as he does so, this is after living with him for a while, he puts together a list of Sherlock Holmes' strengths and weaknesses. So he says that Sherlock Holmes does have his limits. His knowledge of literature, nil. Philosophy, nil. Astronomy, nil. Politics, feeble. Botany, variable, well up on belladonna, opium, and poisons generally, but knows nothing of practical gardening. He has a knowledge of geology, practical but limited, tells at a glance different soils from each other. After walks has shown me splashes upon his trousers and told me by their color and consistency in what part of London he had received them. His knowledge of chemistry is profound, and anatomy is accurate but unsystematic. Sensational literature, he knows, is immense and appears to know every detail of every horror perpetrated in the century. He plays the violin well. He's an expert single-stick player, boxer, and swordsman, again, relating back to Doyle himself, and has a good practical knowledge of British law. His IQ is estimated to be about 190. In his last bow, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle mentions that Holmes retired to a small farm 5 miles from Eastbourne, and he's living the life of a hermit among his bees and books, located in a tiny village of East Dean. Okay, so from here, we did a study of the study in Scarlet, just a real quick overview of that story. Watson meets Holmes, thanks to his introduction by Watson's friend Mike Stamford. Watson is amazed by how Holmes can know about Watson's recent life. They become flatmates, renting an apartment in kind of a nice part of London, unlike Auguste Dupin, who's outside the city in kind of a shabby area, trying to save money. Holmes ends up in a pretty nice part of London. He describes Holmes was certainly not a difficult man to live with. He was quiet in his ways, and his habits were regular. And it was rare for him to be up after 10 at night, and he had invariably breakfast and gone out before Watson rose in the morning. Sometimes he spent his day at the chemical laboratory, sometimes in the dissecting rooms, and occasionally in long walks, which appeared to take him to the lowest portions of the city. From here, we talked about America's real-life Sherlock Holmes, William J. Burns, the greatest detective America has produced. And he was part of the U.S. Secret Service. He becomes a star detective, known equally for his ability to hunt down a clue, but he also loved chasing the limelight. He establishes his own detective agency, which takes him to the front lines of America's first wars in terror. He is, and his agents help to apprehend the infamous McNamara brothers, radical Union leaders who orchestrated a bombing in Los Angeles Times building. He was on special assignment from President Roosevelt, and he helped to expose corruption of San Francisco's mayor and a political boss behind the ruling Union Labor Party. It took several years for this particular case to be solved. Burns had to go undercover in the forest of Oregon, the docks of San Francisco, and he becomes famous for getting rid of corrupt government. And he's hailed by the New York Times as America's greatest detective. From here, we talked about a Sherlock Holmes story called The 5 Orange Pips, which is connected to the United States, based on the Civil War. A white supremacy group called the Ku Klux Klan, murders that happened in England as a direct result of knowing secrets. From here, we talked about our song, I Shot the Sheriff, by Bob Marley. Recently, 2012, Marley's former girlfriend says she helped with the song, and it's a reference to his dislike of her taking birth control pills because he wanted to have her to have his baby. The sheriff in the song is actually the doctor who prescribed her birth control pills. Eric Clapton makes the song famous. Okay, so from here, we start to do a quick compare-contrast of Poe and Doyle's approach to informing the reader on the thinking process of deduction and logic. Poe provides a manual, but Doyle shows us examples within the story. We talk about the second example of Holmes' deduction and logic by way of the retired Marine sergeant in A Study in Scarlet, when Watson tries to test Holmes and fails badly. We were introduced to Scotland Yard detectives Gregson and Lestrade and their professional conflict and their different personality styles. We talked a little bit about the foundation of Scotland Yard, its beginnings, and up to where and what it is today. We talked about a kind of hidden museum within Scotland Yard of all famous cases and artifacts that Doyle was actually able to see. We are introduced in our story, A Study in Scarlet, to a secret youth gang, the Baker Street Irregulars, and why they are a valuable asset to Holmes' detective practice. Actually, they were the ones that kind of found our murderer in A Study in Scarlet. And we were able to conclude the end of part 1 with 2 murder victims and the apprehension of the murderer. And we have the means and we have the opportunity for the crime, but no clear motive. Part 2 explains the motive of the time. And we are introduced to a religious group called the Mormons. And part of the story is based on actual historic fact, kind of adding in the characters as part of the story. So we know that the British were very fascinated by the Mormons of the day. And of course, Doyle writes about that in his story. And so basically, at the end of our story, at the end of part 1, of course, Jefferson Hope is our murderer, and he wants to tell his story to the police because he kind of feels justified in murdering Stangerson and Dribbler. And we, as the reader, we have to make that decision at the end. Was he justified or not? And some of you wrote about that in your reflections. Good job. Okay, so from here, we kind of switched gears and we talked about a contemporary British detective series entitled Inspector Morse. Morse is a modern day, but he's kind of a Renaissance man in many ways. He loves history. He grows up and lives and dies in Oxford, and it has a lot to do with the university and the city. He's kind of a good dresser. He's not shabby in that respect. He likes nice cars, and he likes to drink a lot of beer. Of course, he does have a partner that he plays off of. He's kind of mean to him sometimes. But his partner, by way of either accident or saying something, kind of sparks something in Morse's mind that helps him solve the crime. So, in actual fact, the partner is a very integral part of the solution to Morse's investigations. Okay, so from here we talked about Smooth Criminal, a song by Michael Jackson, and discovered that the name referenced in the song Annie is actually a CPR doll. We talked about some of the historic materials and character of Brigham Young. And we finished up our story, a study in Scarlet. We introduced Agatha Christie, more modern day, much easier read. Her Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple both have similar endings where all of the suspects are gathered into a room. The hypothesis is laid out to all of them, with some one of the suspects admitting guilt at the end of the story. We talked about another TV drama that kind of fills in after Inspector Morse. This is a military detective program called Foley's War. And it takes place during World War II on a lot of military base. It connects to United States because at that military base were a lot of American soldiers. A great series. Foley's a kind of a real down-to-earth character. We next talked about a song from Steely Dan called Kid Charlemagne. And it's a song about a drug dealer that was famous in the beginning, but becomes, in fact, a failure at the end. We talked about at length Agatha Christie's crime novel Murder on the Orient Express, about a Belgian detective, Hercule Poirot, who solves a grisly stabbing of an American tycoon traveling on a long-distance passenger train. 1934 story has been adapted for a new movie. I think there are about 4 of these movies on the Murder of the Orient Express already. And it's about revenge. And connected to a real life kidnapping murder of the Lindberghs in the 30s. Okay, so we seem to have this theme over and over again of authors taking real life, either historical or crimes, and putting them into a fictional story. We had an article, Critical Analysis, Murder on the Orient Express by Singran Singe. Crime fiction was a popular genre due to the way it served as a form of escapism from the stress of the world wars. As P.D. James stated, what the detective story is about is not murder, but the restoration of order. This is reflected through the common characteristics of the genre. This includes suspense, several murders, detectives attempting to keep track of murder's next move, a complex plot, and a psychological approach to reading characters' personality and behavior. Societal values and ideas reflected in the genre include justice, truth, law, and order. The outcome served to the villain of the story is often perceived to be justice. However, the idea of justice is challenged within Christie's novel, as the murders of the primary villain do not receive punishment for their actions. This contradiction of social norms of the genre, where books such as The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Conan Doyle ended with the murder being brought to justice. This perception of justice supports the growing trend of vigilantism within the time period. This is seen with movies such as The Mark of Zorro, Robin Hood, and texts such as Zorro by Johnson Macaulay. The war had devastating effects on citizens' faith in the law and God, which made vigilantism appealing in popular culture. Resources were depleted. Hysteria was caused due to mass deaths and the seemingly endless war of attrition hurting the economy. This pain incarnates into the spirit of vengeance present within this book. The work alludes to the French Revolution in 1789, where the people's justice included killing the higher classes and the monarchy. Like how the monarchy escaped prosecution due to their money and status, the murderer Ratchet does the same with his wealth and the secret hold he had on various persons to be acquitted from his murder of young Daisy Armstrong. The failure of the law is expressed in how Ratchet was able to change his name from Cassetti to Ratchet and go traveling. So in some vengeful revolutionary spirit, Daisy's family murders Ratchet. It's interesting to note that there are 12 murderers that participate in Ratchet's murder, the same number 12 as on a jury. Okay, and we talked from here. We talked a little bit about Miss Marple, another one of Agatha Christie's later detectives, grandmother type. And then we talked about a song, "Hey Joe," by Jimi Hendrix, which was written by a singer named Billy Roberts, who was part of the Greenwich Village folk scene in the early 60s. The song is structured as a conversation between two men, with Joe explaining to the other that he caught his woman cheating and plans to kill her. They talk again, and Joe explains that he did indeed shoot her and is headed to Mexico. This is the song that started it all for Jimi Hendrix. We did some compare and contrast between Hercule Poirot and Sherlock Holmes. So some real basic things, of course, is the time period. We're talking another 50 years or more between the two of them. Much more technology has come the way of Hercule Poirot compared to Sherlock Holmes. But some of the bottom lines, I would say, would be, Sherlock Holmes was out there. He's investigating. He's looking at clues. He's going to crime scenes. He's interviewing people. Hercule Poirot is kind of more laid back in his approach. We don't really find him out there digging around in clues so much. He's more of a mental thinker and analyst. He's a little tricky in his way that he questions things. But they, at the end of the day, they kind of end up in retirement doing the same things. Holmes is kind of a beekeeper out in the countryside and reads books, and Poirot is in the countryside reading books and gardening. So, interesting to know. Okay, so we're going to take a little break here, and I'll get back to you in just a minute. So, after we did our compare-contrast with Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot, we talked about the birth of American detective fiction. And this was a literary phenomenon called Charlie Chan, which was actually based on Hawaiian police detectives. And we talked a little bit about Charlie Chan, the novels, books, cartoons. It was kind of a big thing back in the day. Charlie Chan movies can still be found on YouTube. It's kind of a soft-spoken, quiet guy at a time when there was a lot of racial tension about Asian Americans. So it's kind of unusual that during that time period that America's first real American detective would be of Asian descent. After that, we talked about the arrest of Paul McCartney in Japan and his song Band on the Run, which is a song about breaking out of prison and the ensuing chase by the police and others. We again talked about a Sherlock Holmes story. Probably his most famous story was called The Speckled Band. This is a story connects to India and snakes and family squabblings about money and inheritance. We talked about the shortest Sherlock Holmes story, which is part of a dollhouse collection in Windsor Castle. And again, it's a story about Watson trying to use Holmes's theories of clues and deductions to kind of guess what Sherlock's thinking about on a particular day. And Watson fails miserably. We talked a little bit more about some of the mystery genre types. Locked room mysteries, the Golden Age, hard-boiled American crime fiction, police investigation themes. We talked about 6 of unsolved murder mysteries of all time. One being Jack the Ripper, who terrorized London, the Black Dahlia, California, grisly murder, a serial killer called the Zodiac Killer, who taunted the police with clues and used secret cryptogram messages. We talked about Tupac Shakur and Notorious Big. Those 2 murders. We then kind of talked about a movie character, Dirty Harry, Clint Eastwood fame. We talked about the mysterious death of Natalie Wood. I don't know if it's been declared a murder just yet. Pretty close to it. A lot of unanswered questions in that so-called boating accident. We looked at something called Killer Bites from Facebook. I think it's a weekly post where they post these unusual crime fiction, non-fiction crimes, a lot of them unsolved, basically looking at things while the presenter is cooking, of all things. Kind of an odd method of presentation. And then we looked at our song for that particular week was a police lip sync challenge, which was won by a police department in Virginia. And then some international police through the recent dance phenomena to the song Jerusalem. And finally, we kind of talked about an author that we looked at back in Lit 4, O. Henry, and he writes a story called The Ransom of Red Chief. So that was our reading. Kind of a funny story, a caper story, taken from the point of view of the kidnappers, and how they got their just dessert by kidnapping, obviously, the wrong young boy, and how they actually had to pay the parents money to get rid of the kid instead of getting ransom money. So, Henry doesn't disappoint. We talked a little bit about some real life mysteries, not criminal, just basic unsolved mysteries. Well, actually, a couple were criminal. The first one was the Isabella Stewart Gardner museum heist in Boston. Still yet unsolved. Still lots of questions. We looked into the strange skyjacking of D.B. Cooper, who takes over an airplane, demands $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, lets all the clients on the plane go. There's only himself, maybe one stewardess and a pilot, co-pilot. He jumps from the airplane over the mountains and forests in the Pacific Northwest. Some of the money is found many years later by a little boy near a riverbank, but no body, no parachutes. Later, many years later, some of the kids of D.B. Cooper find some mysterious notes and things in their recently departed father's belongings, which kind of pointed to him as being D.B. Cooper, but several people have said that they were D.B. Cooper. He becomes kind of a myth at the time, even today, celebrated in the Northwest in different restaurants and bars as a kind of a holiday for D.B. Cooper. And then we get off the criminal stuff, and we looked at some of history's greatest mysteries. We looked at a military mystery called Flight 19. Several Army, Air Force personnel after the end of World War II are on a training mission from Florida, fly into what's known the Bermuda Triangle. They lose all sense of direction. I think there were 5 planes. All 5 planes crash. They send out another plane, a plane that's able to land on the water. That plane ends up crashing, possibly exploding. Very strange case. Never been found. The planes have never been found. Bodies have never been found. We talked about a song by Gordon Lightfoot called The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, a ship that sinks unexpectedly shortly after leaving port in the United States in the Great Lakes, somewhere in the Great Lakes in Canada. And then I think our final story is a long song by Aloe Guthrie. And we had an introduction to Aloe Guthrie and his life. He's still alive, still producing songs today. I think he and his son are in a band together. One of the guys I went to grad school with was a teacher to Aloe's younger son. And this was in Western Massachusetts. And so it was parent-teacher night. And Aloe comes in, and he asks the teacher, how's the kid doing? And the teacher says, well, basically he doesn't do much at all. He's not really doing his homework. He doesn't seem to be paying attention. He's not doing very well as a student. And Aloe's response was a question, well, is he having fun? And that was just kind of Aloe Guthrie. So Aloe Guthrie writes a song called Alice's Restaurant. And it's a true story of himself and another young guy that get arrested for the crime of littering and all of the calamity that takes place as a result of helping his friends get rid of some garbage that they've accumulated. And he makes a movie of the song years later, using the same police officer that arrested him and the same judge that sentenced him. It just kind of shows you the sense of humor that Aloe Guthrie has. And he made light of the whole incident. So that's kind of basically the highlight topics of what we've covered in the last semester. So I hope that this will encourage you to continue to pursue mystery and mystery fiction as part of your reading habits throughout your adult life. They're fun to read. If you like to solve puzzles, this is a great way to do it. Again, getting back to our original statement that fiction is a lie that tells us the truth over and over again. So, really enjoyed teaching this class and having you as students. Good luck to you. And I hope to get to Debrecen soon so that we can all meet in person someday. So some of you are graduating. Congratulations with that. You are absolutely fluent in English language speaking and writing. You are all kind of set up into pursuing any kind of international careers that involve English language. So good luck to you. I wish you well. And again, it was a real pleasure to be part of this class. So from there, we'll say goodbye. And I hope to see you again my next trip to Debrecen University. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.